So, well, thank you, Izzy. Great to chat with you today to talk about all things architecture, design, development, housing, planning, things like that. So, I guess a bit of an introduction, if you want to tell us a bit about why you're passionate about this stuff and what's driven you to sort of have the public debate in the community about this.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful to be talking about these topics with you. But by way of introducing myself, my name's Izzie White. I studied architecture in Brisbane. I'm a Brizzy girl from way back, although I do currently live in Melbourne. And my education in architecture taught me a couple of wonderful things about how to interpret the cities that are getting built around us. Over the last couple of years, I've been segueing out of being a practicing architect and segueing into social media
Mm.
and media and comms. And the reason I started making that transition is because I realized there was this big bubble of or lack of public debate happening around good design in our cities and what that looks like. So I now work professionally in media in architecture, but on the side, I've been making short educational videos on social media to explain cities, explain modern architecture and why this looks like that and why that's actually a great thing and how you can have conversations around it. That journey's been going on for about a year, and I've been blown away by the public's response and interest in how to understand the city. So that's kind of what kicked me into gear, why I'm so passionate. It was always there, but it's really sort of
Yeah.
solidified why I'm so passionate around this communication, this role of being a public communicator between industry, policy, and the public, and what that
Yeah.
means for our cities. And I would say, quite selfishly, I want a great city to live in too. And I want to take that conversation out there and make sure it's not being gatekept
Yeah.
behind any sort of industry bodies and technical language.
Yeah, and then that fed directly up to governments, I guess, at a policy level and where it sort of sits. So I guess just to throw a different one in there based on what you just said, the sort of intersection and difference between what often is the public debate. When I say public debate, I mean like as a planning scheme change is made and announced, it's often just about the sort of mechanics of it. We're talking about height limits here and car parking ratios there rather than about design and how that fits in sort of with a living and breathing city. And so I guess that's what you've tried to achieve through this. And so
Yeah.
the first thing I saw that you had done, the first thing I sort of stumbled across, and the algorithm obviously worked, was the sort of discussion around colour in Brisbane, the sort of the pinkness of the original Brisbane building
Yeah.
material and how we've, and I see that all the time. You see new builds, it's just like this stark white walls and grey, Fed Square style stuff being shoehorned in all over the place. But was that something that sort of sparked you off as well?
Yeah, I think in particularly in the Brisbane School of Architecture, I studied at UQ. There's there's different ways to approach good design, but something that we get taught from a very young, a beginner's age in architecture is understanding the place that you are designing in. Like, I understand Brisbane, and part of that is our
Yeah.
heat, our climate. It's also Indigenous histories, not just our sort of European history.
Yeah.
And so that is actually what makes a city special. When you go traveling overseas, you do not want Paris to feel like New York. You want them to be different. You don't want Tokyo to feel like London. And understanding that really intrinsic quality about your city lets you design specifically to it. And so that
Yeah.
video, I think, really was an example of, it was a bit tongue in cheek, but it was an example of looking at what we have that is so unique and using that to drive forward development. I think in cities, you've got to be pro development, they're always going to change, but we
Yeah.
don't have to reference the sort of anonymous whiteness of the international style. It could be anywhere. And so really it was quite a tongue-in-cheek way of getting people to engage in a concept of being very proud of what we have and using that to move forward with development. And, designers know this, but it's about sort of getting the design community to also be part of those conversations, much more than just supply, numbers, heights. It's like, how do we make people proud to be here? How do we attract tourism? And it's going to come from this sort of very deep understanding of what makes Brisbane Brisbane, not this international or sort of anonymous style, I should say, where it's just a numbers game.
um, uh, Tapping into what is, I guess, unique about a city like Brisbane. What have we, building on those strengths, what have we got right so far, I guess, in terms of design and of uniquely housing people?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big topic. How to house a city. Brisbane has some incredible strengths when it comes to being a growing city. I think the climate allows it's a lot more forgiving in Brisbane, and it's been fantastic moving between the two cities, Brisbane and Melbourne, to see some of these differences playing out in real time. So Brisbane inherently, I think, has done a really great job of celebrating its connection with the river so far. I think we can do
Yeah.
more, but if you compare it to Melbourne City, we have way more access to the river, and the reason why that's important is because it is almost this default built-in public space. You've
Yeah.
got this openness and this access to nature, which is there by default. We didn't even really have to try.
Yes.
And so I think South Bank's relationship with the river, the new works underneath Queen's Wharf, Howard Smith Wharves, the
Yep.
River Walk, wrapping around to New Farm, they are fantastic things that make inner city living possible and still have access to nature. So one thing I do want to point out is how brilliant the river is at giving us almost like a get out of jail free card. When it comes to housing and densities, I do think that Brisbane is kind of reaching a new point in its city growth, and I think that that's important to acknowledge because I would actually say it's true of a lot of Australian cities. We have the lowest density cities in the world, just about. So I don't think it's a problem specific to Brisbane, but we've sort of had a lot of room for a long time. And we're getting to this point in our cities where we can't just keep spreading out and out and out and out and out.
Yeah.
And so now we're having these conversations around, well, what are the alternative models, which is where density comes up. And there are great things about density. Density is again, one of the reasons why when you travel to those big, beautiful cities overseas,
Yeah.
often it is to do with how dense and compact those cities are. And that brings amazing economic opportunities for people. It can also be a lot better for the environment, which we can get into later. So
Yeah.
I can see Brisbane tipping into that. Like West End has had a couple of really great developments. The Tenerife Newstead sort of hub above the gasworks is incredibly high density and is
Yeah.
incredibly popular. And that was the result of some really clever public space master planning, and again having the river as its sort of default extra space. It has good amenity, that great sort of shopping center that's at the base of a lot of those residential. So I do think we know good high density. I think we know what like comfortable low density suburbia looks like too. I think we as a city are tipping into understanding that not every, if you're going to live in a city, it is mathematically impossible for everyone to live in a 5-bedroom sprawling family home and be 15 minutes from the CBD. And I think that's a new thing to grapple with. We've never sort of hit this point in the city. So I do see that as the biggest opportunity for Brisbane as
Yeah.
it sort of moves into the next round of development.
And I think in terms of activating the river as a public space through the 90s, then went hand in glove with the sort of changes we did see in those inner urban areas as well. Like you talked about, I think post Expo 88, in the sort of early to mid 90s, the council administration at the time had a very laser-like focus on instead of Brisbane having its back turned to the river, sort of turning front on and interacting with the river.
Yeah.
So then insisting on design, whether it's, office tower or residential in the city in South Brisbane, actually interacting frontwise with that, which then enabled things like river-based public transport, which then all of a sudden connects places like Hamilton over to the eastern suburbs, the Bulimba Peninsula, back into the city, Newstead, New Farm, then back to South Brisbane, that sort of thing. So I guess they were deliberate decisions
Yeah.
that enable that sort of stuff, which I guess is the sort of thing we need to see to build on that, I guess, in
Yeah.
those sort of deliberate decisions. And they weren't without controversy either. I think I'm a bit young to have been there myself, but having read
Don't worry,
about,
me too.
yeah, but having read about the conversation that was had with the community, particularly around converting the old wool stores in new
Yeah,
farm into higher density and then spreading all the way down to the sort of gasworks area eventually. It was something like 7,000 objections to it at the time in Brisbane, which today would be absolutely extraordinary given our population, let alone
extraordinary.
what it was back
Yeah.
in the 90s. But I guess the council was very clear-eyed about it and pulled it off, and was successful electorally and politically for a long time
Mm.
after as well. So in terms of what you have seen in public policy and politics interacting with planning, I guess that's a good example. Any advice on how to try and pull that off
Oh,
from the
it's
outside looking in?
yeah. What a tough it's such a tough place to be in. I think there's like change is scary, generally speaking. And
Yeah.
so one way, and I should also say, fast change can often be damaging. It doesn't always win. And I want to explain that a little bit because I don't want to sort of fearmonger.
Mm.
It's not something that happens all the time. But I was recently attending a panel, and there was one of the great developers down here who genuinely do very good and responsible work, and they were saying they understand that when they see a really cool, groovy spot, and they realize that they want to do a development there, they can potentially start eating their own tail, quote them, as in,
Yeah, right.
and basically what we're talking about is gentrification. So
Yeah.
rapid urban renewal can have displacement effects, absolutely. And that's often what a lot of the pushback is on. 30, 50 years on, cities generally recover. People in the market are incredibly good at finding out interesting areas in our cities. And I think there's probably urban designers that would be able to talk to this process better than me. But one thing I have learned on my social media journey and sort of having these big public conversations around the overlap between policy, architecture, urban design, landscape, something that seems to be a much more useful approach is long-term engagement with the community on
Yeah.
overarching goals and themes. And this sort of long-term vision, so 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, developing that up with community for a long period of time in an ideal world. And I think there's a great international precedent, which I've forgotten the name of right now, but over 5 years, they work with the community to come up with this 30-year plan.
Yeah,
So
right. Yeah.
5 years of consultation, and then any development that happens that hits those goals has a much more streamlined approval process. So it is balancing
Mm.
objections of people who are scared of change, but maybe misinformed or maybe not thinking about the long-term goals of the city. Of course, it's about balancing that, but also understanding that people that live in a community are going to be the economic driver of any successful development, and you actually need it to work for them, because otherwise the thing doesn't stack up, right? Like if it's not something people like or want to hang out at, if it's a cafe that sits on a street with 6 lanes of traffic, no one goes there, the lease collapses, so it is this constant tension. But the best answer I have heard since having these public debates is the better and longer term engagement you can give the community, it's less scary when a project gets proposed, because they know what the vision is long term.
Yeah.
And they can make their own decisions about it. If you're buying property and you're putting up a lot of money, you want to know what's happening in that suburb, and they have the right to know. So that's the best solution I've heard. It's obviously hard to do. It's pretty hard to do in a housing crisis when all anyone wants is more housing yesterday.
Yeah.
But there's like a great quote that any designer will tell you, and it's I think it's by a guy called Ralph Speth. I'll double check that name, but it says if you think good design is expensive, wait till you see the cost of bad design. So you can either get it right the first time, or you spend the next 25 years retrofitting in things you wish you did at the beginning, and it's more expensive and more complicated to do it later. So yeah, that's the best answer I've heard. More and better long-term engagement with the community about their suburb, and therefore the projects that hit that should have a streamlined approval process.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because what we've sort of seen, I guess, hit the nail on the head in a current context of seemingly needing to push things through really fast and rapid because we're in the housing crisis, and the supply is talked about as the sort of silver bullet. But the more you read where cities have had similar problems and have talked about supply, they get to their sort of end or after a 8-year period or 10-year period, and then ask themselves, what have we been supplying? The supply of what, essentially? And a lot of US cities have
Yeah.
seen some reports recently where they've sort of over the last, like cities that have rapidly built and rapidly developed housing, it has, without, I guess, being had the right intervention and the right policy settings, resulted in more supply and higher vacancy rates, but it's of a product that pushed out a whole lot of people, lower
Mm.
socioeconomic people from those cities entirely. And so I guess supply is part of the answer, but the supply of what? And getting that right.
Honestly, yes. That, and you're the first one of the first people I have spoken to that has clocked that. It's not
Yeah,
just
that's not an
supply.
original
It's
idea of mine, I got to say.
no, no.
Just
It's
from research I've done, but it's
yeah,
something I've been very conscious of as we've had these debates around the sort of precinct planning we're seeing, or changes to LMR zone land and things like that.
yeah,
We are in a housing and homelessness crisis been caused by a whole range of different things, but if we are only seeing isolated examples of luxury units being delivered in certain places, you might be able to say at the end of the year, well, we've supplied X amount of extra bedrooms, but for who, I guess, is the
yeah,
question that we need to be constantly asking. And on
yeah,
the consultation thing you talk about is really critical, because it's not lost on me. We had a debate in the council this week about changes to LMR zone land. And so this is citywide. It's not just a small area. It's 14% of the entire city, but across a huge range of suburbs. So it would impact a lot of people. But there was only something like 500 submissions. It might seem like a lot when you get a package of papers, yes, 500 people, but
yeah,
a city of 1.3 million people, it seemed very low to me. And
yeah,
so when you talk about the better engagement, the longer it is, the clearer you are on where you want to get to and what it means for people living there,
mm,
I think is critical. It's something I feel like probably happened in the 90s, why we see those 7,000 pieces of opposition to a policy, probably were thousands in favour, and then they took a long time to get that planning right, which
mm,
then delivered for 20 years. We're sort of at
mm.
the point where we didn't do that again 10 years ago. And so I guess, yeah, that's one of the big challenges for a city like Brisbane now. You can then end up being a bit piecemeal in your
Yeah,
delivery of things.
yeah. And I mean, again, what's a story of two cities. Melbourne has had some amazing things to learn from. I think it's a bigger city, and so it's hit this point a little bit earlier than Brisbane.
Yeah,
And there's some like tales of what not to do maybe in precincts like Docklands. Not to bring up too many Melbourne projects, but I think it is relevant
yeah,
because it is the Docklands precinct was this approach to let it rip and we'll see what happens. And it's a notoriously difficult part of the city to keep economically viable. It's just full of empty leases. And
yeah,
then conversely is Nightingale Village in Brunswick, which was actually led by a whole bunch of architects down here. And if we, anytime anyone asks me about density in Australia, they are the first precedent benchmark that we've actually done it. We know what good design looks like. We know how to build in
yeah,
community. We know how density can support local business. We know how to make sure density doesn't can add in landscaping because they're much bigger buildings, and so you often don't
yes,
get that garden aspect to it. We've done it in the design community, but it's about learning from it and getting that policy to reflect that. And that's actually the really hard part. It's people often, I've been asked a few times, like, what do you think architects could be doing? And it's no longer about architecture. We actually know what a good outcome is. It's about trying to get everything else sorted out. What happens when you have 10 buildings next to one another? Like, what happens to the street? How much landscape is
yeah,
left? Is there a habitat corridor? And all of that has to come from basically not from the design community, but from a overarching policy and strategy approach.
yeah, definitely. And sticking to it.
And
actually,
sticking to it. Absolutely.
until when
Yeah.
you're clear-eyed about it. So in terms of that, I guess we probably sort of covered a bit off that, some examples, but in sort of if we can try specifically Brisbane context, so there's some sort of bits of advice you'd have about pitfalls, thinking about the actual sort of, reality on the ground there, what
Yeah.
you learn from those cities in a
Yeah.
different, our streets are narrower generally than the Melbourne city. It was not planned out as early and
Mm.
as richly, I guess, in the sort of historical colonial context a bit. So we're hamstrung in some ways here, but what sort of lessons you could apply from other cities if possible?
Yeah, I think the main point I'd like to communicate in a question like this is the difference between master planning and upzoning. And
Yeah.
before I go any further, I want to throw out a massive call out to the Urban Design Forum and Kath Sunderman and Andy Fergus in particular. If
Mm.
anyone ever listens to this and wants further advice on this matter, I would say they are the leading body in Australia for answering this exact question. But I can tell you everything they've taught me over the last 6 months.
Yep.
The difference between master planning and upzoning. So across most Australian cities right now, I think I'm right in saying that, our approach to density is picking an area on a map. It's at the center of that area. It's probably got either a really good shopping center or street, or it might be based around public transport. We go, amazing, this can handle more people. We're going to just increase the height limit in all of these areas and we'll slowly scale it out once we get to suburbia. And it's assuming that the private market can deliver everything that comes with those extra people. It's definitely fast. It's definitely the fastest way to increase density. But there are some lessons to be learned, probably from overseas, I would also say, where we don't have a good precedent for this working. Australia's cities are incredibly unique. We are huge, with a huge country and incredibly low density. And it's very difficult to find precedents where that makes sense. But if that is upzoning, so they just go, here's an area, bang, plus 6
Yeah.
stories or whatever it is, master planning does something a little bit different. And I realized for the first time that people thought the two were equivalent when I was talking to Yimby Melbourne, actually, down here, who are obviously very pro-development. And they'd had a massive win, they'd had a whole bunch of sort of upzoning happen, and I was in conversation with them, asking them about their opinion on the difference between, if there is such a thing as good density and bad density. And where the conversation sort of ended up was, well, master planning does something really different. So when you upzone a whole area, all of the land value increases.
Yeah.
So anything council wants to do from the second you hit go is now X times more expensive in terms of acquiring land, amalgamating sites for future parklands, whatever it is. So the idea of master planning is that before upzoning happens, you do that sort of longer planning consultation piece. I guess we have sort of touched on this now. The longer planning consultation piece, you realize that, if you buy these 2 sites, you can connect these 3 green spaces, and all of a sudden you've got a habitat corridor in your city. The second you let it rip in private development, they are unable to do that. And that's not their fault. They have no idea what's getting built next to them. So how could they predict that 2 lots over, if they had just pulled back, an extra 4 meters, they could have had a habitat corridor? They could never predict that. So I want to be careful in it's not, I'm not blaming private development. It's just that the structure is not there for them to even be able to deliver that. And I've also been, and so they're doing the best they can. Often they're doing the best they can because they want their product to sell. So that's what they're good at.
And I've often said, it's not controversial to say that private development companies, whether they're just small scale or massive national ones, they're in it for profit. Like they're a private company.
They're a business.
So yeah, it's not controversial to say that their product is built, to a sort of scale that provides them with an economic return for their shareholders or the private owners.
Of course,
But
and it's really
it's
risky
sort of
heading into development.
Yeah,
So
it is. But it shouldn't be left to them to sort of do that scale planning. They're just operating in that space where they can and doing what they can, essentially. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so therefore the conversation for the public is about, okay, we're going to increase housing, we're going to add all these new people to this area. who pays and delivers the public realm, and that is the core issue. And we I don't know if we've nailed it. I would like to again say, bring it back to this point of I also don't think we've sort of hit this point in our cities before. Living in densities, your lifestyle changes in a great way. I want to make sure that this is a positive conversation, but it is not the same life as living in a big 5-bedroom rambling home where you get in the car to do everything because you're in a suburb and the shop's over here. Density is a totally different lifestyle. It should be walkable in a city. You shouldn't need a car in my books, dream world. So there's this direct relationship between, as we live more densely, and I want to say, like, that's just normal. Like, Australia's density is abnormal. As we build in normal density, you spend a lot more time out in the public realm than retreating to a private veranda or a private backyard. That relationship is quite direct, and that makes sense. If you sort of are living in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, that third bedroom that maybe became the study or the art room or the bike shop or whatever becomes the public realm. And it's why it's so important to have those spaces that are low cost or community run. Months of learning about it to be able to get it down into that sentence. So it's been a journey. But please good. take it and do something with it. It's no good definitely. Sitting with me.
So maybe just jump back into the
sure.
river, and then the importance of
livable communities people can afford.
That was the last one, which I sort of skipped over one of them, about the sort of affordability piece and the challenge between just the supply argument. We touched on a supply of what, but how do you actually make sure that it's a city for all, not just sort of thinking that there are some suburbs and the reality of often what we've got. And I've had this with my own friends, my own contemporary people. We sort of grew up together, and I was just lucky enough to get in early enough in the suburb of Deagon, which was really quite affordable back in the day. You could buy a house when I was buying for $350,000 to $400,000. They were renting in Deagon, and they were going for $1 million by the time they were ready to buy. And so they're at Ipswich now, and that's where they'll make their lives. And you hear that all the time, people shifting to Ipswich, further up into Moreton Bay Council and to Logan, out of Brisbane, and whether just bringing unit developments out of the ground is the answer to that, I guess. It's not entirely in your
look, affordable housing affordable housing is such a specialized area. However, there's probably some things I can talk to, stories I've been collecting as I've gone on this journey myself, trying to understand all the levers. I think quite importantly to point out is that when we say affordable housing, what does that mean to you?
Well, I guess this has been the challenge, right? In just a generalized concept of housing that is affordable for working people, essentially. So whether we're talking about rentals or people buying their first home, there's the sort of standard equation, whether it's like, not if you're spending more than 30% of your income on that housing, which is an easy one to equate for rentals, you're in housing stress. I know people who've been able to scrape together enough money for a mortgage on a $900,000 very small, modest home in an outer suburb of Brisbane, who are spending over 40, close to 50% of their joint wage on the mortgage costs. They've bought it, but servicing it is going to put them at a huge disadvantage. So that is a legitimate question, whether the purchase price or the rental price is below market value by a certain percent, or whether you're using a certain percentage of your wage to pay for it. I guess if you just take the sort of the median average income of an Australian and go, what's 30% of that? We've probably very, very few. All that research shows that I think there's like one suburb in Brisbane out of 190 that would be technically affordable at the moment.
If I was going to quote Rachel Gallagher, who is a Brisbane planner who also makes TikTok content about how to understand
I've seen
planning.
Some of Rachel's stuff.
Asking the private sector to deliver affordable housing is a bit of a red herring. It can be done, but at the end of the day, the builder is actually what sets the price of the apartment to sell. So
Yeah.
the cost to build is at market rate.
Yeah.
And therefore the developer needs to sell at market rate.
Market rate, yeah.
So it's the whole concept of affordable housing coming from the private market is a very unusual debate. And there's a great podcast on this I recently listened to, hosted by Grimshaw Architecture, called The Housing Hijack, which I highly recommend. That really delves into this and has a lot more knowledge in this area than I do. But really, the concept of being able to deliver and manage below market, either rent or cost to buy, has to come from government.
Yeah, it needs intervention.
It needs intervention. So I struggle to sort of answer that from someone working on the architecture side, because who is going to absorb the cost? A private developer is not a charity. They are a business to run. There are good examples of developers being able to add in small percentages of below market rentals or housing. It's pretty tough. If you wanted to really move the dial in a city, it has to come from a government goal, basically.
Yeah, I think so.
Some sort of ambition at housing its people.
Yeah, and I don't think that's sort of challenged in any real sense. I think that has to be widely accepted as a reality. And so I guess there's different options of doing that, whether it's governments, becoming partners in those developments and providing that percentage and that level of genuinely affordable housing, not even talking at the sort of public and social housing end, we saw that 10 or 15 years ago with the NRAS policy, which was an attempt at that in a rental sense. So basically subsidising the rental costs in a suburb, which put downward pressure on rents overall in that type of product that was available in the market. But at a time also when construction costs were lower. So there are elements I think we do accept in this. But also there's the other model, which is community housing providers who play in that space but are not playing for profit. They need a return on their assets long term so they can keep investing. But I guess if you have governments and institutional investors like super funds and that coming in and supporting a product over a 30-year period, there's different ways of doing that. So I guess in terms of providing a sort of at a city the size of Brisbane, often we're told that if more 1 and 2 bedroom or studio 1 and 2 bedroom units even are brought online, that is affordable, but it's only a sort of in comparison to something else. So
maybe in comparison to a house in that area. Sure.
Of course, a studio apartment in Hamilton is cheaper than a 5-bedroom house on the hill in Hamilton.
Yeah.
But is a studio apartment in Hamilton that's built in 2026 still technically affordable? That would be debatable on all of those measures, whether it's based on your income or based on a purchase price, which is a big challenge for us at the moment.
Yeah, and I would agree with that on all fronts. It is a question of, at the moment, the way that we're doing it, affordability is a question of where you want to be or how big you want your lot of land to be. You either have the apartment in the place that you want it, and for the same amount of money, you might get a house on city fringe somewhere. So at least that's the experience that I've seen and had. I'm in the same market trying to work out. So
that's right, where you make your life, right? In terms of the concept of inclusionary zoning, it hasn't been something that's been even tested in Brisbane, let alone rolled out.
I don't know if I'm that familiar with what that means. Could you give me a little bit more context?
Yeah, so I guess in the sort of context that I talk about it is where you can give developers, private developers, or even where they can partner with community housing providers or be entirely with a community housing provider, for that matter, having extra height and density and more concessions, I guess. But you also then have to provide something that is more affordable in doing it. So where one example might be where it's zoned for 6 stories for sort of full private development, if you're allowed to go up to 8 or 10, as long as a portion of that is genuinely affordable. And it gives you a bigger yield, I guess, and some concessions around the planning scheme. whether that works around the world, it just really hasn't, or would work in Brisbane. It's just never really been tested.
Yeah,
as
I've heard about. I don't think we call it the same thing down here, but not that matters. But it can work. Sometimes the good things come out of it. I'm thinking there's a couple of examples I can think of off the top of my head in a city where extra height limit has been allowed because they've agreed to include a park on their site.
Yeah, right.
I think it's I think it's sort of like the better of two evils. I'd love a better phrase to use there, but the better solution would have been to do the master plan in the first place. Then you wouldn't need to rely on to do it. I still would hold that position. It's sort of like a B+ option. It's not an A+ option because it does set precedent, obviously, then for other developments to come along and say, well, can't I also do that because I'm building on the site next to them and actually they hit that height, and you can get a bit of a runaway effect. So case-by-case basis, I think it's not something to ever rule out, but I don't think it should be the default way to try and get public amenity in the city.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point too. I don't think, it should be done outside of or in place of doing proper master planning as you have described. So I guess just back on the point of the construction costs and those constraints that are on builders and developers at the moment. There are housing types and different types of housing stock that is more affordable to construct than others. So often here in a Brisbane context, if you get a 30, 40 story building or even a 20-story building or whatever, the cost of excavating a basement for car parking is really quite expensive and adds to the cost of that. And there's the whole debate around car parking ratios. Even a sort of small scale unit development in a 5K ring suburb might put the build cost of a unit at $1 million. So then the purchase price has got to be that plus whatever other margin there needs to be. Townhouses are, in the Brisbane context, according to the UDIA, who we've spoken to, still probably the most affordable housing to build in terms of construction costs. Might still be running at something like $750,000, but certainly better than paying $1 million or plus $2 million or $3 million for a large inner city sort of bespoke unit. So if we sort of know that's going to be the case for a long time in Brisbane's context, because there's going to be shorter construction workers with the Olympics, civil construction plus hotel accommodation plus the housing need, how do you sort of, in an academic sense, then go with all of that information, how do we get the most out of the cheapest thing to build, which at the moment is standalone houses can't be the answer because you can't get enough of that, don't have enough room, and don't have the infrastructure to service them as they go further up the coast. But that low to medium density product, and how do you make it work? In retrofitting
if I had the
suburbs
answer to that, I'd be a millionaire. It's so tough. It is the core of all of these conversations we've had actually come back to the construction industry. And because there's so many articles you can look up. It's like, we don't have an approval process problem. We have a buildability problem. There's heaps of projects that are approved, but we can't build them.
Get them out of the ground.
Australia is incredibly expensive. Our labour costs are huge. There's also an incredible skills shortage, which you've just touched on, which means supply and demand. You're going to pay whatever you can to get a trade. That problem isn't going to go away on its own. I don't have the answer to that. What I can talk to is maybe explaining why we are seeing this sort of split between single-story housing or the townhouse and then the 20-story tower. Because there's so much in between, right? It's like, how can we... The reason we keep getting that 20-story tower, is because by the time you add up all the costs to do an apartment, so you have to get a rubbish truck on site, you have to however many bins or skip bins you need, rubbish chutes, car parking per apartment. By the time you add that up, it's actually way more affordable. Affordable to buy if that cost is spread out over 800 or 600 apartments as opposed to 4 apartments.
Or even 20 or 30.
Or even 20 or 30. Because when you're building that, the rubbish truck thing still applies. The car parking thing is still required. You've got a lift. Whereas when you go to a terrace house, a single home, you don't have those same built-in requirements. You can still drag your bin out to the street. et cetera, et cetera. So the buildability and the cost of construction in Australia is a major issue. I wish we got to talk to builders more often in the same room. I hope one day I get to be in the same room as them having this conversation, because their knowledge and their skills really are the missing piece often in these conversations. A lot of people from like a big commercial architecture point of view are looking at trying to get modern methods of construction, which is anything from prefab, modular, so on, to sort of miss that hurdle of having labor shortages. It's a pretty new area for Australia, though. It's not necessarily cheaper. So that is, I don't have an easy answer to that, but it's important to raise, because at the end of the day, we can have all the reform in the world, we can have the best planning intent, and if we can't build the bloody thing, it's not going to go anywhere. So
exactly,
it's a huge issue.
We've spoken to the likes of Master Builders and Australian Industry Group in terms of the sort of those modern methods and just sort of building practices, and I know they're advocating for a whole lot of changes to even to the sort of extent of what trades are required to do what in the construction of this, even in the context of large scale buildings that are going up, unit buildings. The sort of fit and finish of stuff sometimes has to be done by qualified tradies of a certain level, where it's just painting a sort of cornice or something like that, which often hamstrings a project as well. And I think one of the biggest costs is time delays as well. So obviously, if everything, not just materials, but having people on site and contracts in place for equipment, materials, if it drags out by a year or 2 years because of a supply chain issue here, it then impacts on all that stuff down the line, which I think is what we have seen a lot of in Brisbane over the last few years as well. This sort of compounding. It's like an accumulation of lots of small things, in a lot of instances, have led to a big thing. Even without like one reason why the housing crisis is not that, it's like all of these things that we've had there over a long period of time. And also now in the response phase, I guess, is on the planning side of things, is a sort of scattergun approach. Desperate, I guess, is probably not quite the right word, but the sort of, we have to sort of throw everything we got at it now, and we can't spend too long talking about it. And what that looks like in 5
and when has that ever worked for anyone? No, totally. The pressures are there, but God, don't we want to do it right the first time?
I think that's exactly right. Go back to that point, like, if you think it's this bad, like,
if good design's expensive, wait till you see the cost of bad design.
See bad design. The cost of bad design. I think that's probably covered everything. I'm looking over at Paul is looking at my notes. Did you want
to finish the River City point when she was cut off there?
Oh yeah, sorry, we didn't really go back to that. Like the Brisbane River City wise and being connected in that sense. The other point to that too, I guess, is the sort of environmental constraints on development on a city like Brisbane versus other places you've seen too, I guess, in the sort of flooding we see here, the importance of. It's a hotter, more tropical city. Although I think it's, I don't know, Brisbane's changing. It's hot.
It is changing.
We've got a tropical winter. We've got 10 days of rain now in June, which is really quite incredible up here.
The flooding thing is interesting. But I think we know a lot about that, architecturally speaking, at least. It just takes looking at a good old Queenslander up on stilts to realize we've sort of thought about this before. It's not a problem that's going to go away. It's definitely going to get worse. I guess the only comment I'd really make is that it's so easy to forget the damage that can be done. I recently saw a approved proposal for a big hotel down underneath Howard Smith Wharves. And that was very confusing to me to see, because that whole area went underwater twice within my time in Brisbane. So I guess the only thing I'd say is we just can't forget. And part of that is building in landscapes that can help deal and sponge with the city. That's a huge part of sort of flood and rainwater runoff mitigation, is understanding that the green infrastructure we have is actually doing so much heavy lifting. And when we just pour everything back into the city off hard paving services without that built-in landscape, which is we're only going to get with the master plan, you're really just adding to the problem. So that's probably the only thing I'd need to say.
I think landscape planning people and who are I don't know what I'm struggling for the exact title of who they are, but landscaping engineers, or I guess, and
landscape architects.
Yeah, landscape architects and people who sort of design those flood solutions. Obviously, back, what you talked about too in the context of, say, along the foreshore here in Sandgate, every house was up on stilts for a different reason not just for ventilation and things like that, was because there was seawater inundation all the time. As infrastructure changed a bit and the seawall was put up, and so that happened a lot less often. People, I think, did forget a bit, and they started building in, and they built living spaces under that were completely ground level, and then they get flooded and they start to ask the questions, what can you do to stop this? And sometimes the answer is you just don't build there, because there is no engineering solution to that problem. It's just we have to adapt to how we're living in this environment. And as it's getting worse, as those weather events intensify, change, cyclones later in the season, flooding, rain, and sort of why in May and June are we getting hundreds of mils of rain in a city like Brisbane? So I think being attuned to how that is all impacted on with development. But a great example, I think, of like what you talked about in terms of a natural environmental green, as in living response to flooding concerns at Hanlon Park at Stones Corner, a place that's sort of been densified a lot over the last few years, and we'll see more now because they've had a precinct plan there, which will lift its density up. But there was a project, it was about $20 million, so a lot of money went into this, that was very well designed in bringing up the concrete drain and putting in place.
Perfect. That's a great precedent.
And it's proven over a couple of significant flood events there that not only does it absorb a whole lot more of the power and volume of that water now, but it also bounces back. So it's a natural park that everyone can enjoy. It gets flattened by flood. A couple of weeks later, it's back and
at it.
People are using it again. It's proven its flood mitigation. Though that's the first and last one we saw. There's so many more, I think.
At least we've got one to use as a precedent now.
That's it. That is the good news out of that one. But I think, in terms of how we deal with flooding in a city like Brisbane, obviously there is a design element to that, but there's also a response, which is probably going back to first principles. And seeing, when we arrived here, you hope there were some records too, which we know the flood of the late 1800s existed, how that impacted on places that weren't built but are built now. And I think, I think you hit the nail on the head. Sometimes we forget, and the year following a flood, people don't, and there's a heightened sense of
it's about 5 years, 5 years. And it's left our collective memory.
And if you don't jump on those planning scheme changes and design changes of things straight away, I find it sort of it loses its currency a bit in the debate, which is a bit of a problem sometimes. But at least we're talking about it.
That's part of the solution, not the problem.
Exactly. Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate that today, and the conversation you're having out there. As I said at the outset, often somebody who sits in a room which contributes to making a decision. I'm not in the driver's seat in the administration, but I like to play an active role in that debate. Often what we are debating is something that is sort of set in stone already. And so it's important for any decision maker, any politician, any person that is within government, even not at an elected level, I think, to have these conversations. So I appreciate that you're doing it on your own out there. I appreciate then you've brought that into this space with me. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. But it takes two to tango. It's a great thing to be here, to be able to have this conversation with you anyway.
Thank you.